So yeah, as you said, the effort here is to try and turn the L1 itself into a zk rollup. Many years ago, Vitalik added Snarkify everything in the roadmap, and it seemed like a distant future. But now we're just a few months away. We're definitely less than 2 years away, in my opinion, from achieving this. And once we unlock this, we'll be able to dramatically scale the L1. Hence the title of my talk, GigaGas L1. So let me just explain a little bit more what I mean by GigaGas. What I mean is 1 gigagas per second, which is roughly a 500x increase of throughput that we have today. And if your average transaction size is 100,000 gas, well, 1 billion divided by 100,000 is 10,000. So that's an equivalent of 10,000 CPS. And the tools that we'll be using to unlock this breakthrough is called zkEVMs. So this is a fairly recent tool that has been developed over the last couple of years. And the basic idea is that you can reuse all of the existing execution layer clients, for example, ref and gef, and compile them to these so-called zkEVMs and prove statements about the code. For example, you can prove that the whole EVM block is valid. So for every EVM block, you have these corresponding proofs that are very easy to generate. It all works kind of out of the box. And one of the key constraints that we have here is this notion called real-time proving, whereby the proving latency, the time it takes to generate these SNARK proofs, is quite low. It's less than 1 Ethereum slot. And the reason why we have this requirement is that the attesters, the consensus participants in Ethereum layer 1, they need to be able to attest in real time, and they need to receive those proofs in real time so that they can start relying on them. And this is a big departure from the zk rollups, where they don't really have a requirement on proving latency. So once we have snarkified the L1 EVM, we can really change the paradigm for fully validating nodes. So if you're a validator, for example, instead of having to download the blocks and replay them or re-execute them naively, you can just verify these succinct proofs. And the verification time is on the order of 10 milliseconds on a single core. So it's extremely fast. And importantly, it doesn't rely, it doesn't depend on the gas limit. So you can have very high gas limits, and the proofs will still be very succinct. And another great advantage is that you don't have to download the blocks. So it's sufficient to do what's called data availability sampling, where you just sample random parts effectively of the block. I'm simplifying a little bit, and that allows you to save not only on compute, but also on bandwidth, somewhere between 10x and 100x bandwidth. And essentially, once we enter this new paradigm of having zero-knowledge proofs, SNARK proofs for EVM blocks, we've solved the scalability trilemma, which I kind of think of just simply being a dilemma between scale and decentralization. We can have the attesters have very, very weak hardware, have home internet connection, so we get the decentralization, but also effectively an unbounded gas limit. At least the bottleneck for increasing the gas limit is no longer the validators. It shifts elsewhere in the pipeline. So Tomasz, the new executive director at the Ethereum Foundation, has been pushing internally to grow the gas limit in the short term. And he's been pushing for roughly a 3x per year. So we started the year at 30 megagas, 30 million gas. And he's hoping that by the end of the year, we'll be close to 100 megagas. And this is something that could definitely be achievable after Fusaka, which is the next hard fork. And he's also hoping that by the end of 2026, we could reach 300 megagas. And Dankrat, not too long ago, wrote an EIP where he's basically suggesting that the default behavior of consensus and execution layer clients should be to vote for an increase in the gas limit that is exponential over time, specifically 3x per year, and that would be over a period of 4 years. And so if we go through Dankrat's plan, we would reach 100 megagas per second in 2028. Now, what I'm suggesting we do is basically we extend this exponential growth for 2 more years, because after all, why not? The technology should be able to get us there. And in 2030, we should be able to reach 1 gigagas per second on Ethereum L1. Now, not only are we potentially entering a new era of scale for Ethereum L1, but also a new era of decentralization. Typically, the meme for Ethereum decentralization is that you can be a validator on a Raspberry Pi. In reality, it's not completely true. You need to get an external hard drive, and the total cost will be around $300. But with zero-knowledge proofs, you don't need this external hard drive. You can have a totally stateless setup, and the new meme, in some sense, that I'm suggesting is that you only need a Raspberry Pi Pico, which is a $7 piece of hardware. And that device here should be able to fully validate the entirety of Ethereum Layer 1. Okay, so there are 3 big challenges to achieving this new paradigm of snarkifying the L1 EVM. The first one is to reduce the latency to reach real-time proving. Remember, getting the latencies under 1 Ethereum slot. The second challenge has to do with safety. So zkEVMs and snarks in general are fairly complicated pieces of software that involved sophisticated mathematics and cryptography. And how do we make sure that we deal with bugs and vulnerabilities in a graceful way? And then the third part has to do with liveness. So here we would be introducing a new type of entity called the prover that is responsible for generating these proofs. And we want to make sure that the Ethereum chain keeps on producing blocks at all times and continue our streak of perfect 100% uptime since Genesis. Okay, so let's start with the latency. So in order to unlock real-time proving, we actually need to change the definition a little bit of real-time proving. Like naively, real-time just means it happens at the exact same time. But we need to relax this requirement a little bit, and in order for it to be feasible. And the design that we have basically gives the provers almost a whole slot in order to provide the proof. So here you have the block proposal for block n, here you have the proposal for block n+1, and the expectation is that the proof for block n would arrive just before the block n+1 with a little delta. And so the proving time basically is from this blue line to this green line, and it's on the order of 10 seconds. So we're trying to get the proving latencies under 10 seconds. And there's 2 EIPs that basically would make this feasible. One is called delayed execution, where the block hashes, sorry, not the block hashes, the state roots are delayed. So the state root of block n is delayed to block n+1. And there's also Enshrine PBS, which would have a similar impact. Now, recently, a couple of months ago, we formalized the criteria for real-time proving. And what precisely we mean is that the latency is less than 10 seconds for 99% of the blocks. And we have all sorts of other requirements that I'll talk about. So we want it to be high security. We want the proof sizes to be small, and other things like that. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so we want to reduce latency. Where does the latency come from? Well, when you prove an Ethereum block, you have to do multiple things. The very first task is what's called data fetching, where you fetch your EVM block from some sort of Ethereum node, and you do a little bit of massaging in order to get the auxiliary data to feed into the zkEVM. And specifically here, we're talking about the Merkle paths, the authentication proofs corresponding to every state that is read or written to. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is to split the block into what are called sub-blocks, so smaller blocks. And the idea here is that these sub-blocks would be processed in parallel as opposed to sequentially, because snark proving is a massively parallelizable task that you can farm to a cluster of GPUs, for example, and by splitting a block into sub-blocks unlocks some of that parallelization. Now, once you have sub-blocks, you need to do what's called tracing, which is basically executing the sub-blocks, and for each sub-block, generating an execution trace, hence the name tracing. And this is going to be effectively the data that you do actually feed into the zkEVMs. And then starts the heavy cryptographic operations. So I call it crunching, where you do a lot of fast Fourier transforms, FFTs, or MSMs, or similar types of operations on polynomials. And then there's another phase called aggregation, where you have multiple proofs, for example, corresponding to each sub-block, and you want to aggregate all of the sub-proofs into one master proof that will be the one proof for that block. And then once you have the proof, you gossip it, and then it gets verified by the validators or any fully validating node. And it turns out that in practice, the bottlenecks here are the tracing, because this is an inherently sequential step, the aggregation, because here there is some amount of sequentiality involved. Specifically, if you have n sub-proofs, you will typically aggregate using a binary tree, for example, and that tree will have depth log n. So that there's a little bit of latency there. And then the gossiping is also quite expensive. But everything else can basically be made very, very fast, or can be parallelized so that it doesn't take much time. Okay, so remember this idea of the sub-blocks. It only really works if we have a gas limit per transaction. And the reason is that today you can have one single transaction that consumes all of the gas limit within a block, and you won't be able to break down this big block at a transaction boundary. And so in Fusaka, we have this new EIP, which is going to be super helpful for zkEVMs, which introduces a per transaction gas limit, specifically of 30 million gas. And so as we start increasing the gas limit to 100 megagas per second or gigagas per second, then we're going to have lots of these sub-blocks that will all be processable in parallel. Now, in the last few months, we've had an incredible amount of breakthroughs related to low latency snark proving. Even just a few months ago, it took minutes in order to generate an Ethereum block, and now we've finally achieved real-time proving. So we have multiple teams out there that have proven that it's possible using large clusters of GPUs. And the way that this has been possible is through breakthroughs at every important layer of the stack. So for example, the data fetching, there was a breakthrough from zkCloud. The splitting into sub-blocks, that was a technique that didn't even exist just a few months ago. It was invented by SP1. Zisk, all of these are basically names of projects working on zkEVMs. Zisk had a massive breakthrough with the tracing. That was a 10x improvement over the status quo. Airbender has dramatically improved the crunching, and RISC-0 has dramatically improved the aggregation. You don't necessarily need to follow all of the details here, but if you are interested, these are links, and I'll be sharing my slides. And combined, again, they allow us to reach real-time proving of the EVM. Now, if you're interested in following this journey towards real-time proving, there's a website that has been launched about a year ago. It's called eVProofs, available at eVProofs.org, and you can track the average cost and the average latencies. This screenshot is actually quite outdated now. The average cost is just a few cents. Some zkEVMs are able to prove a whole Ethereum block in about 1 cent. So if a typical Ethereum block has 100 transactions, the cost per transaction is 100th of a cent, which is absolutely minuscule. And the latencies, these are latencies for a single GPU. They've gone down quite considerably. And then when you have multiple GPUs, this is where you unlock real-time proving. And yeah, there's all sorts of information, including the equivalent of the L2-bit pizza for the zkEVMs, so that you can dive into their various properties. And actually, eVProofs is kind of the equivalent of L2-bit, but for zkEVMs. Now, eVProofs is also organizing various events. So we had an eVProof summit in Berlin, and we are going to have an eVProofs day at DevConnect in Argentina on November 22nd, which you're welcome to join. Okay, so that was latency. I would say it's basically a solved problem. Like, we know how to prove EVM blocks in under 1 slot. Just as a little teaser, there's a team out there that has achieved 99.9% real-time proving. So way more than what we're asking for, which is only 99%. And I'm hoping that this will be announced publicly shortly. Okay, so on the security side of things, the strategy is basically to rely on diversity of implementations. So just like we have multiple consensus clients and multiple execution clients, this is clientdiversity.org, by the way, and we assume that any one of these clients could be buggy at any point in time. We rely on the diversity in order to get strong security properties. And for zkEVM specifically, we are in an extremely luxurious position where the client diversity exceeds that of the execution and consensus layer clients. So you could call those, if you will, PLs, proving clients or prover clients. We have on the order here on the screenshot, we have 9 of them, but there's more that are being built, and all 9 of these zkEVMs are able to prove the L1 EVM. One thing that you'll note here is that one internal detail to these zkEVMs is which ISA do they target, and RISC-V seems to be winning, at least right now. Okay, so we're relying on diversity of zkEVMs. Any individual zkEVM could be buggy, but how does this materialize in practice? Well, in practice, the suggestion would be that we pick n different proof systems, and for each proof system in zkEVM, we have a gossip channel, so that means we have n different gossip channels that the validators can subscribe to and download proofs. And then the tester will attest a block being valid if it can download and verify k of the n proofs within that slot. And if that's the case, they will just go ahead and attest. And the specific numbers that I have in mind, at least, is k equal to 3. And the idea is that if each proof is less than 300 kilobytes, then 3 proofs will be less than 1 megabyte. And that's a reasonable amount of data that we can assume the validators are capable of downloading per slot. And my suggestion is to have n equal to 5, and the reason is that this matches the diversity that we have for the execution layer clients, as well as, coincidentally, the consensus layer clients. Okay, so we have this fantastic zkEVM diversity, but it's important to not lose the EVM diversity that we currently enjoy. And in the context of zkEVMs, there's this terminology called the guest program. So that's the program that is actually being proven. And today, unfortunately, we have very, very little guest diversity because everyone is using ref, specifically REVM, the Rust implementation of the EVM within that ref is using. But the good news is that we're starting to see other EVM implementations also being snarkified. So ETHREX is another Rust client that's been implemented by Lambda class. That's starting to be snarkified. We have EVM1, which I believe is written in C++. And we also have efforts to try and snarkify GEF and all sorts of other clients. And so here, we have all of the different EVM implementations, and the hope is that we'll be able to snarkify them by finding an appropriate zkEVM. So a lot of the zkEVMs are RISC-V. This is what RV stands for. Most of them are RISC-V 32-bit, but there's this variant called RISC-V 64-bit, which should be able to support many more clients. So this is something that we're actively working on to improve the diversity of the guest programs. And there's basically two ways to approach things. You can either have these high-level EVM implementations that you compile, for example, through LLVM, which is a compiler tool chain, or you could just have a direct snarkification. And it turns out that several teams have gone down that route. For example, Linea and Kakarot. Okay, so we have a diversity of EVM clients, great, and EVM implementations. We have a diversity of zkEVMs, but isn't this problematic? Because now we have a quadratic blowup in the number of combinations of guest programs and zkEVMs. And if we have 5 and 5, this would lead to 25 different combinations and 25 different proofs that the clients will have to download. And so the specific proposal that we have is what we call slow-fast pairing, where we basically order the zkEVMs by speed, by proving speed, putting the fastest one at the top and the slowest one at the bottom. And then on the EVM side of things, we put the slowest guest program at the top and the fastest one at the bottom. And then the way that we do the pairing is that we match the fastest one with the slowest one and vice versa at the bottom. And the hope is that by balancing out the performance, all 5 combinations of clients will be able to achieve real-time proving. Okay, so I guess I'm going through these slides very, very quickly. We have quite a bit of time. I think we have 35 minutes. I'm hoping that we can leave a lot of time for questions. That's usually what I enjoy the most. So we've kind of gone through what it takes to make a zkEVM very fast. You have to optimize multiple pieces of the stack. A lot of progress has been there. This is a solved problem. The safety, we're leaning on client diversity. There is another approach, which is to lean on formal verification, but this is something that is going to take a lot more time. So in order to have an end-to-end formally verified zkEVM, that might take 3, 4, 5 years. And once we have that, we'll be in a position where we could potentially enshrine, so just pick one proof system and enshrine it in consensus. But in the short and medium term, we'll be leaning on diversity. And then the third part is this liveness issue, which is possibly the biggest thing that we have to work on in the short term to really, truly unlock this superpower for Ethereum. So we have these new entities called the provers, And one very nice thing about SNARK provers is that we rely on what's called an honest minority assumption. So we only need one out of all of the provers to be online and doing their job correctly. So this is very, very different to attesters, right? With attesters, we have an honest majority assumption where we require at least half of the attesters to be honest, and this is very difficult to achieve. On the other hand, this is much easier. But what we do need to make sure is that the N here is sufficiently large. And in particular, we don't want to be relying on data centers, right? Because around the world, there's about 100 data center companies, and potentially you could imagine that they will all censor Ethereum at the exact same moment in time. And so we would much rather N to be significantly greater than 100. And so what we're hoping to do is have what we call on-premise proving or on-prem proving, where if you are some sort of a sophisticated entity, you could potentially do the proving at your home or within your office or some other premise that is not a data center. And the requirements that we're setting ourselves are that of an electric car. So, millions of people around the world own an electric car and also own a home charger. And for example, here, the Tesla home charger will draw on the order of 10 kilowatts. So that's electrical infrastructure that's readily available in millions of homes. And this is the kind of budget that many millions of people are able to afford. And so for the GPU clusters that we're encouraging people to set up, these are the constraints that we have. And it turns out that in practice, the bottleneck is the power. So if you give me $100,000 to go buy a GPU cluster, more likely than not, it will consume more than the 10 kilowatts. So if we zoom out and look at the history of zkVMs, there's been these phases. So the very first phase was, can we even do it? Yes, we can snarkify EVM blocks. The next phase after that was, can we reduce the cost? Yes, we reduced the cost down to 1 cent for a whole EVM block, which is absolutely insane. Next step was to improve the latency. Yes, we can get it down to less than 10 seconds. And now the next thing that we're really working on is reducing the overall power consumption so that people from their homes and their offices are able to do that. And we're not quite there yet, but we will be there, possibly by the end of this year. And then if I were to kind of predict the future as to what is the big next milestone to work on once we've solved power, it would be this simplicity thing, where today the zkVMs are extremely complicated. And in order to have a single zkEVM which is enshrined and formally end-to-end formally verified, we will need it to be extremely simple. Okay, so the good news here is that bringing the power consumption down should totally be possible. It's just a matter of engineering. And the reason here is that for almost all blocks, a single 4090 GPU, so this is a gaming CPU, is able to prove an EVM block within 16 slots. And the way that snarkification works is that it's highly parallelizable. And so you should be able to get close to 16 4090s being able to prove an EVM block in 1 second. And with Moore's law and the improvements of the GPUs, you can start using 5090s, which are more energy efficient, and you'll only need something like 12 of these GPUs. And 12 5090s is going to consume less than the 10 kilowatts, which is the budget that we set ourselves. And so just to put things into pictures, here we have a GPU cluster at home with 12 GPUs, and that is the kind of infrastructure that an enthusiast who wants to help with the liveness of the Ethereum network can set up, for example, at home. And this is something that I'm intending to set up at my home once it's feasible. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, but I have all sorts of extra slides. But I'll pause here in order to allow for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin, for that great presentation. So the way I think questions should work here is that if anyone has a question, I would ask if you could come up towards the computer so that he could hear you clearly. Or actually, what we could try out is we can ask the question from there. If you don't hear it, then we could try that. So are there any questions for Justin? Yeah.
Justin, thank you for taking the time for the Munich crowd. Very interesting to hear that. My question is, if we reach this state of Ethereum and this kind of scalability, do we still need L2s?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite catch it.
He's gonna come up.
Yeah, considering we will reach this state of Ethereum and
Yes.
scalability, do you think we still need L2s?
Okay, great question. Yes. So 10,000 transactions per second sounds like a lot, but we have 10 billion people in the world, and when you do the math, it turns out that 10,000 transactions per second is only 0.1 transaction per day per human. So it's just not going to be enough for the whole world. In my opinion, what we need for the whole world is 10 million transactions per second, which corresponds to 100 transactions per day per human. And the only way to get there is to have L2s and horizontal scaling. And 10 million transactions per second is 1 teragas per second. So the L1, I think, will reach the gigagas frontier. That's fantastic. But then really what we need is the teragas frontier, and that can only be unlocked with L2s. Now, the way that I see it actually is that reaching a gigagas at L1 is a stepping stone to reaching a teragas for the L2s, all the L2s combined. And the reason is that my mental model is that the L1 will be a hub for the L2. So all of the deposits and withdrawals will go through the L1, all of the settlements and the asset minting and the forced exits, all of that will be services that the L1 provides on behalf of the L2s, and 10,000 TPS is sufficient to handle that base load, but all of the more granular activity, especially the activity which is less economically dense, will all happen with L2s.
Great. Anybody else have a question?
I guess I have one.
Yep.
Hi Justin, I would like to ask you if you have run some calculations how this could have an impact on the current issuance rate of the ETH and burning rate, and how does it impact on money soundness? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So regarding the issuance, it's kind of completely orthogonal. Right now, I believe that the issuance curve is somewhat broken because it incentivizes every rational ETH holder to stake. And what we should expect is that the amount of ETH stake to grow and grow and grow and get closer to 100%. And that has all sorts of negative externalities for Ethereum. It kind of sucks away a lot of economic bandwidth from DeFi. It incentivizes wrapping of staked assets, for example, in LSTs. That introduces all sorts of systemic risks, like contract risk, governance risk, custodial risk. And so my personal proposal is to cap the amount of staked ETH to 50%, for example, and to do so by having an issuance curve that tapers down to 0 as you start reaching the cap. But that is kind of a separate question. In terms of the burn, I think the burn will, over the long term, through transaction fees, through base fees, will be very meaningful, but it will mostly come from the blobs. And that might sound like a difficult to appreciate statement, given that historically, almost all of the burn has happened with execution as opposed to through the blobs. But what's happening, in my opinion, with the blobs is that we have more supply than we have demand. We're in this growth phase where we're trying to scale the amount of blobs as fast as we can, and we haven't really reached this price discovery that leads to a lot of burn from the blobs. Now, I think this price discovery is eventually going to happen. It might take a few years. By the way, it took several years for Ethereum L1, right? For the first 5 years, for example, roughly speaking, of Ethereum L1, there was very little transaction fees. It's only 5 years in that we started having price discovery, and we might see a similar story with blobs. And part of the reason why I think the blobs are going to be like so revenue generating for Ethereum L1 is that, again, they're going to be undergirding this enormous throughput, 10 million transactions per second. And so here the unit economics work extremely well, whereby even a fraction of a cent is per transaction paid is sufficient to bring in billions of dollars of income per day. So the way that it comes out is that 1/10 of a cent per transaction, right? So that's a 1,000th of a dollar is sufficient to generate $1 billion per day of burn. So really the economics work extremely well once you have this enormous throughput, 10 million transactions per second, and therefore very small requirements on the per transaction fee. So we'll see how it evolves, but my best guess is that over a period of 5 to 10 years, we're going to be settling millions of transactions per day, and that's going to bring enormous amounts of income in the form of the burn. Now, if you were to combine these two ideas, stake capping with a change of issuance curve and a dramatic increase in the total burn, you enter this so-called ultrasound regime where the burn is greater than issuance and the supply starts going down. And I'm relatively optimistic / confident that over the next 10 years this regime will come back again.